Okay, so here are the 5 reads, possible reads, some harsh, some charitable. Okay, the first one is they caved in. Francis laid a trap for them and they just ran right into it. You could even say they took a swan dive into the trap. Now, this is understandable. These priests, you need to understand, I know many of them. They have been spiritually abused for 33 years. They have lived at the fringes of the Catholic Church. Bishops don't like them. Local clergy don't like them. There is misunderstandings even within the fraternity and in the institute. Not everyone gets along. It's a hard place to be in 2021. And people who have been spiritually abused sometimes just look for the way to not get smacked around one more time. So a trap was laid and they ran into it. They said, whatever you want, forgive us. We want dialogue. We will quote Sacrosanctum Concilium. We will quote Lumen Gentium. We will quote Vatican II. We will quote Amoris Laetitia, the most controversial document of Pope Francis. Just don't hit us anymore. Don't take away anything else. And I can understand that. As I said earlier, Ecclesia Dei was born out of a peace pact. There was tension in how do we maintain the faith within the liturgy. Archbishop Lefebvre's answer was the 1962 Missal. That went forward until 1988 when he got old. And there was no longer a bishop to ordain and confirm in this traditional tradition. So you have to make new bishops. There was back and forth dialogue. There's that D word. Dialogue with Cardinal Ratzinger and John Paul II, back and forth all through the summer of 1988. I detail those conversations as best I can in my book, Infiltration, if you want to learn more about that. There's a whole chapter on it. Eventually, dialogue broke down, and Archbishop Lefebvre did what he felt he was compelled to do, and he consecrated 4 bishops. And that led some priests in the Society of St. Pius X to meet with Cardinal Ratzinger and forge a peace pact, which becomes the Fraternity of St. Peter. And you have to realize that, and I know everybody watching has their favorite players in this, but let's just be honest that maintaining the perennial dogma of the church and maintaining the perennial liturgy of the church, and yes, I know there's modifications to liturgy over time, but not total changes like we saw in 1969 and 70. That's a Catholic principle. But it's also a Catholic principle to obey the Pope. To obey the Pope. I'm going to put back on the screen, in case you came in late and you didn't see this, there's a distinction in Catholicism between the assent of faith, which is an act of the supernatural virtue of faith, believing in the Trinity, believing in Christ, heaven and hell, virgin birth. And then we also, as Catholics, have religious assent. And this is based not on the virtue of faith, but on the virtue of obedience. So, for example, if my bishop says you have a holy day of obligation on December 8th, I am obliged, I have to assent religiously by attending Mass on December 8th. Fast on Good Friday. I have to do that. Only use this missal, not that missal. That's religious assent. It is not unconditional. And so the debates that we're talking about, which is, for example, do or don't consecrate 4 bishops, Archbishop Lefebvre's decision, falls under the religious assent. And was he justified not to or to consecrate? The second read on this document is they were overly submissive to Pope Francis because something way worse is about to happen that we don't know about, and they are trying to prevent this really bad, evil eventuality. They even say in the communique of apostolic visits. So what they did is, this is the second read, is they used Francis's weapons against him. So they used the word dialogue, they used Amoris Laetitia, they used Vatican II. They begged for dialogue 5 times, and they're trying to flip it on Francis so that they don't get totally beat down or suppressed. That's one read. Another read, the third one is, they know, or they hope, or have a strong hope, that Pope Francis in the next few months is going to resign or die. So they said, hey, let's just wave the white flag because change is coming. That's one read. Again, it's not my read, but it could be a read on this document. Number 4 would be to say, no, they did the right thing. They submitted to the Pope. If you look at the poll that I took for this show, did Latin Mass groups like FSSP and Institute cave in last week to Pope Francis? 75% of you said yes, they caved in. All right? You took a negative read on it. 25% of this audience said, no, they did the right thing. They rightly submitted to the Pope. This group is looking at religious assent, which is right here next to my left ear. And they're saying, no, if the Pope says to do something liturgically or restrict something, it doesn't matter ever. You submit to the Pope. No questions asked. That's the right thing to do. 25% of this audience believes that and says, no, bravo, I support the Ecclesia Dei communities are doing the right thing by submitting to the Pope. And I got to admit, as a traditionalist, that is a Catholic belief, a Catholic sentiment. The difficult position that we find ourselves in is how can we be in a situation where the Pope is, and maybe a council, are teaching things that are ambiguous or dangerous, unclear, and that we look around us and we see decline in belief in church attendance, belief in transubstantiation, belief in infant baptisms, marriages, divorces on the rise amongst. Something has happened. Danger has been introduced. How do we both submit to Rome, submit to the Pope, which is the right thing, and then also preserve the faith? Got to admit, it's a tough one, isn't it? So the fourth read is, no, they did the exact right thing. They might sound like they're groveling, but they are submitting rightfully with religious assent to the Pope. Now, the fifth view would go even beyond that and say, well, they submitted, and we should always submit. They should maybe even submit even more. This would be more of your progressives in your church, your James Martin. They would say, if Pope Francis calls up these superiors of Institute of Christ the King, Fraternity of St. Peter, and says, I want from now on for you to say the traditional Latin Mass 1962 Missal, versus Populum, facing the people with a Pachamama on the left side of the altar, you should do it. He's the Pope. You religiously assent always to the Pope. I mean, isn't that what it says next to my left ear on the screen? Based on the virtue of obedience, you always submit to the Pope. And then that brings us back to the principle that obedience always has limits. And where is that limit? Where is that limit liturgically? The Pope says you must not have a crucifix on the altar. Do you have to obey that? Or if he says you must have a Pachamama on the altar, do you have to obey that? Where is that limit? That's really what the traditional debate is all about, isn't it? And this is also kind of the difference between SSPX and FSSP. And I think this document reveals the differences even more. Although I've met FSSP priests who sound a whole lot like SSPX priests in the way they talk about Vatican II, Pope Francis, liturgy, etc. It basically comes down to, can we make a peace treaty or a pact with Rome and submit ourselves to it and continue to teach, preach the traditional faith and celebrate the traditional liturgy? Is that currently possible? The SSPX would say, no, it's not currently possible. The FSSP and Institute of Christ the King would say, yes, it is possible, but right now it looks not so possible. It's getting rough. And when you look at that quote that I put earlier on the screen from St. Thomas Aquinas, it also brings out the distinction a little bit. It must be observed, however, that if the faith were endangered, a subject ought to rebuke his prelate even publicly. So, let's go to Lefebvre, Archbishop Lefebvre. Is the faith publicly endangered? It seems like it is right now. And if there's no one to provide seminary, and there's no one able to provide priests, remember, when Archbishop Lefebvre consecrated 4 bishops, no one said to him, oh, and by the way, if you do this, we're now going to create this other thing called Fraternity of St. Peter. He didn't know that. At least I don't think he knew that. That was an after effect. If the faith is in danger, if there's going to be no traditional seminaries, no traditional priests, no traditional Latin masses, no traditional sacraments, can a bishop like Lefebvre rebuke Peter? This is the debate in the traditional groups.